Okay, good evening. This is John Bushka. I want to continue my story of my second coming out. This is based on chapter 3 in my DS and Tell book. There's a section that talk about the 9th Street Center tonight. And just to show you the website again, there's the website for this, the first of the Do Ask Do Tell books. And I'll start but with some illustrations. And unfortunately, it doesn't always remember where you were. And I have to... This is the picture of the George Washington Bridge that we left off with the last time. And what would happen is that I would continue working for UNIVAC. That's actually not the right. Those are the pictures from the last time. There, that's the right one I wanted. So that's a review of the last one. I would continue working for UNIVAC and commuting in from New Jersey and visiting the city a lot, and gradually get to know the community, gradually start finding myself. This is a picture of Julius's, which was my favorite bar on 10th Street and inside 7th Avenue and near Christopher Street. Famous for its cheeseburgers, and you can often have breakfast there and have meals there. It's been in several movies as the Dachshund sculpture on the floor and everything. There were a couple of organizations in northern New Jersey. There was Gay Activist Alliance of New Jersey. There was Gay Activist Alliance of New Jersey, GANJ. I think it met in Teaneck. This is to give you a sense of geography. This is a recent picture of mine of Jersey City, which is not too far away from it. And there was also a group called Gay Activist Alliance of Morris County. And one time I think it was October of 1973, I played a piece of my own at a concert there in a mansion where they held an event. It went something like this. So I actually got to play something I had composed, which was nice, which gave me a sense of satisfaction. But the main thing that was happening, starting probably in about April of 1973, was my getting to know the 9th Street Center, which I covered in the book right here. And that would be in the East Village, more or less in this picture, part of the picture. And this is Lower Manhattan, this would be the East River, and it'd be more or less, East Village would be more or less there. And it was founded by a person named Paul Rosenfeld, whom I've discussed in other videos on this blog, and his partner Dean Hannett. And I started talking to Dean, and then eventually would have some counseling with Paul. And the center was known, Dean had published a book called Homosexuality, the Psychology of the Creative Process, and he was known for creating a theory called the Polarity theory, in which people had individual inner identities which could be masculine or feminine, and they could also include other binary components and powers of two, being objective or subjective. So you could have an unbalanced or a balanced personality. And what does this sound like? Well, it sounds a little bit like gender identity in today's culture wars, doesn't it? Or gender ideology. And, excuse me, and indeed, Paul believed that people did have a sort of inner personality that somehow they inherited, and that affected their values and affected their priorities. But he did not believe this should be used for activism. He believed people should live out their lives, should be their double lives, work and live normally and appear normally, and then have their private lives separately, social lives separately. And in those days, this is the early 70s, this is long before the internet, that made a lot of sense. And you didn't come out, although activists wanted to, you didn't come out immediately all the time. You didn't have to all the time. And protecting your gay rights was partly at the time a right of privacy, at least for people who could sort of pass and who were well off enough and well educated enough and could behave, appropriately. And so that's what he believed. He did not believe that today, and he passed away in 1986, I think, but he would not believe today that this should be used by minors or should be used as a label somebody uses publicly with pronouns and as a way of becoming designated as a marginalized group, for the purposes of getting more civil rights and making sort of demands from the system. He would not have used it, or certainly not to change your appearance with the things that are going on today. So that's a very interesting thing. But the fact that he did have the polarity theory does give some credence to the idea that there is something of an inner identity that exists, that you kind of grow up with as a small child, that exists apart from your biological sex, although it usually corresponds in some way to your biological sex. It has aspects that don't. And this is true of everyone. And so, but this was not to be used for political purposes. This was to be used only for personal growth. But you can see how it carries forward to today. And I think there's also been true the idea of gender identity was invented by other people. John Money, for example, and you can read about it in Wikipedia. There are lots of theories as to how it came about. But that's a very interesting aspect to it. But anyway, I started, going to the center more and more, and sort of depending on it, because I was not very attractive. I also went to a place called the West Side Discussion Group and a place called Identity House, but I looked for groups because I was not very competitive and I had never had sex yet. And that was something I wanted to accomplish. It was almost something I wanted to accomplish. So I was very focused on my own selfish goals in a way to settle my own life. And it became and here's just something. In the summer, I went to Colorado. This is near Trinidad. Actually, I went to Denver on vacation. And then there was a little bit of a furor. There was a little bit of a furor or a problem at work with UNIVAC. They didn't like the way I performed in front of customers, but they suggested that I move to transfer to another part of the company, which eventually meant moving to farther south in New Jersey, farther away from the city, which I didn't like. Here's a picture of the entrance, the basement entrance to the center, and there's a picture of the street, East 9th Street, where the center used to be. I just thought I would show that. And there's a picture of the Stonewall Inn, which is on the other side. That's in the West Village. But at work, I was going sometimes to Minneapolis on benchmarks. Here's a picture of downtown Minneapolis recently at their Pride. This was an event held by a bar called the Saloon. But then I was going to Minneapolis for work and working on benchmarks on the strip, what they call the Strip, the 494 Strip in Bloomington, Minnesota, where all the companies are. Egan, UNIVAC had a big test center for its 1100 series computers there in Egan. So I was also being drawn away from New York by travel for work, particularly to Minnesota. But of course, many years later, I would live in Minneapolis for reasons of my own self-promotion. And at the time, you remember Watergate. Well, Watergate was starting to become an issue in the news, but also the Yom Kippur War in October of 1973 led to the Arab oil embargo and led to the gasoline shortages. And I was very concerned that this would interfere with my ability to get around and move around and meet people the way I wanted to in an environment that was comfortable for me. So yeah, it was becoming important. It was becoming like I really needed to move into New York City myself, which would eventually happen. But I was transferred by UNIVAC to another job in the company that actually meant more benchmarks. And I moved, for convenience, I moved a little bit farther south to Piscataway, New Jersey. This is New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is on the Raritan River, and Rutgers is near there. And it wasn't very far, it wasn't too far from New Brunswick, but that's about 30 miles from New York City. One time I met a guy in a bar in New Brunswick, almost went home with, but that was a close call in 1973. And I tried to meet people. I tried to have a couple of events in my apartment in the summer while I was living there and everything. Also worked on my music, but it was becoming apparent I needed to move. In the summer of 1974, we went into 1974 as I had transferred within the company. I was working on, excuse me, as I was working for the, as I was working on more benchmarks and so forth. Then when that ended, I worked in an office for another client in in Westchester County. Now this is a picture of White Plains. It's not exactly where I worked, but I spent a lot of time there. Sometimes stayed in a motel there at company's expense because it was about 40 miles from my apartment. But this was going on, and then I got a call from someone I had worked with at RCA, who now was an executive at NBC, and he happened to be somebody I had idolized. I didn't feel that way about him anymore. That had dissipated. But I got a call asking if I wanted to interview for a job as a programmer at NBC. And I'd actually been planning to take a trip to South America. And so I canceled that and shortened that to a Labor Day weekend trip to Mexico City and Teotihuacan, which was interesting in itself. But anyway, I wound up getting a job offer from NBC and starting it the Monday after Nixon resigned. And this was very interesting to follow all the Watergate hearings and the radio and everything, and have this going on in my own life at the same time. And so I would start working like around the 12th of August or something like that in 1974 in a building on the 14th floor. There was no 13th floor. I think it might have been this building. I think it faced 49th Street. And I would get an apartment on Broadway at 11th Street in a building called the Cast Iron Building, which is this building right here. And across the street, across 11th Street, the United States Chess Federation used to have its offices. And then it had moved in the middle 60s or late 60s or something to Newburgh, New York, and then it eventually moved again. But at one time, it had been across the street from this building. And the Cooper Union is near there, and then as you go farther east, you go into the East Village. And so I did move, and my first year at NBC was kind of interesting. And it's going to lead to something else, but I'll just tell you. I took a West Coast trip because I accumulated vacation. In 1975, I went to California for a week and visited San Francisco. Here's the Castro, and then drove up a rental car. I had gotten rid of my car. I had sold it to another employee because I didn't need a car if I lived in New York, and I simply rented cars when I traveled into other places. And I remember driving up to Klamath Falls, Oregon, where it snowed in late April, and then visiting the Mount Shasta area, which is where a lot of, sort of New Age cults are. That's actually an employer later, so we'll get back to that later. But there was a confrontation. I stopped going to the 9th Street Center. I stopped supporting it in June of 1975. I had a meeting with a young man named Rick on October the 18th, 1974. It was the first cold night of the fall, and I remember walking from the cast iron building over to the East Village, about less than half a mile to his walk up in the East Village, and I was going to be interviewed for being in a closed talk group, because the 9th Street Center was open every night and it had many talk groups and some kinds of, and people, I was kind of depending on it as clinging to it. And he tore into me for being too selfish in what I wanted from other people, that was hindering me from actually having real relationships with other people, that looking for, idolizing other people, and for not caring about people who were in need, whom I could really help. He really lashed into me about that. It was sort of the best you can do kind of argument, or attacking that kind of argument. And so that kind of made things harder at the center. And then a couple of people got thrown out of the center in front of me that spring in the early part of 75. So I stopped supporting it. And my life would soon kind of take another direction in New York, which I'll get into in the next video. And I think that pretty much covers this part of it, and I do thank you for listening.